All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. We as human beings are proverbial creatures of habit. We tend to repeat the same behavior in recurring context. Habits are the learned association between response and context cues. Once habits are formed, context cues bring out the response without depending on a goal. So with habit, what we intend may not necessarily be what we want or what we do. So in transportation, we both individually and society collectively have formed a lot of bad habits. Many of these habits are directly in conflict with our goals, either tackling climate change or improving public health. So how do we represent and model habits in transportation? And how do we then break those in pursuit in the sustainable transportation? So today, I'm really excited to have Professor Ortuzar join us, share with his research on modeling sustainable options, the importance of habits and perceptions. So before I formally introduce Professor Ortuzar, I want to reinforce the norm of this forum that everybody contribute one idea. So I encourage people to type into the chat one question or comment to Professor Ortuzar's presentation. Right. So as a warm-up exercise, I will do one quick poll first here, which is to what degree your research or practice is related to habit, right? So the first one, habit is closely related to your practice or research. The second one is kind of partially related, or the third one is I'm just curious for the talk. There's 120 people participate so far. Let me give a few more seconds. Okay, there's 160 still coming. Okay, good. I will end the poll and share the result. Juan de Dios, can you see the result? 28%, yes. Their work closely related to habit. 43% partially and 29% curious, right? Hope that gives some context. So the second warm-up exercise is in the chat. I invite everybody to type your organization, your city, and the local time so that we have a context of who the audience are for Professor Ortuzar as well. So I will start at Cambridge, MIT, Cambridge, 12 noon. Nice. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. So Professor Ortuzar, probably you can see the diverse people from all over the place and very different organizations interested in your talk here. So let me introduce Professor Juan de Dios Ortuzar is an emeritus professor at Pontifical University Catholic de Chile, a key researcher at the Institute for Complex Engineering System and at the BRT Center for Excellence. Has over 50 years experience in the areas for travel demand, discrete choice modeling, and survey design and data collection. Has published over 250 papers and several books, including the classic one, Modeling Transport, co-authored with Louis Williamson in the audience as well. Now, actually, the 5th edition will be appear in 2023. It's the must-have book for any student who are interested in modeling transport. Professor Ortuzar received the Edward Tattoo Award from the Organization of American States and the Life Achievement Award from the International Association for Travel Behavior Research and the Humboldt Research Award from the Alexander Humboldt Foundation. Has been the co-editor-in-chief of Transportation Research Part A for almost 10 years, giving a significant service and research contribution to the research community. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Professor Ortuzar, please.
Thank you. Shall I share my screen?
Yes, please.
My God. I'm not being able to this. Okay, right. Thank you very much. I think now you can probably see my full screen.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Sao. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm overwhelmed by the amount of people that is actually listening, and very happily surprised to see a lot of people I know and I like in the audience. Well, I give first a little background because when I was preparing this presentation, I discovered that I have been a fairly consistent person in my life. I did my PhD back in the 70s, at the end of the 70s, working with Hugh Williams, who is a wonderful guy. And in that particular time, we wrote a paper, which is called Behavioral Theories of Dispersion, the misspecification of travel demand models. And in that paper, we tackled several of the things that actually influenced my life forever, really. And in that particular paper, we wrote the first phrase I have here in my background, which I like very much, this habit being possibly the most insidious divergence from the traditional assumptions underpinning choice models, because it appears directly in the response context. At that time, there was some people people interested and pointing out this. Phil Woodwin, I will mention a paper by him later on, gave a very nice presentation about this. And a guy called John Blaze was probably the first to provide empirical evidence about the practical significance of habit at the PTRC conference in 1979. Now, the interesting thing is that this issue has not abated in time because, well, it's pretty obvious. I mean, most computer trips tend to be repeated over time. Therefore, they have the potential of acquiring a very important inertia component. And there have been papers by people like Rampendiala and others, Victor Cantillo and Ben Heidecker and myself and Garner, and several others that look into these issues in certain interest. Now, just to kind of put it into a more clear picture, I will mention, oh, this is not working. This is a problem. Ah, there it is. Good. So let us consider the S-shaped curve, which is typical of binary choice. If you look at this curve, for a given difference in utility, which I'm representing here by B2 minus B1, two alternatives, there is a unique choice probability. And this, if the conditions change, for example, the cost of one of the two alternatives increases or decreases, etc., the probability will correspond to that observed from the utility difference on the basis of the base year. Therefore, the response in this particular model is determined from the cross-sectional dispersion. An implication of this assumption is that the response to a particular policy will be exactly reversed if the policy is removed. That is, the stimulus-response relation is actually symmetric with respect to the size and sign of the stimulus. And that is something which actually doesn't happen in real life, unfortunately, because in real life, my goodness. In real life, if habit exists, it will affect individuals who are currently associated with a particular alternative, but experience a stimulus to the relative advantage of another one, giving rise to a phenomenon which Goodwin in 1977 called the phenomenon of hysteresis in the area of transport, in the transport field. Hysteresis is very well known in other fields like electrical engineering, for example. So here in figure 1b, I have the difference that you could find in practice using a very simplified model. For example, assuming that utility in a second year is the utility of the alternative that was chosen in the first year plus a certain value h, which would be habit, and not only the utility that you observe from the typical attributes that a typical alternative has. Therefore, in that case, if you are, for example, in this curve, if you are growing in B2 being better than B1, you will be growing in this sense as in the typical logit model. However, if suddenly there is a change and B1 becomes better in certain sense, it won't come back exactly using the same line, but it will follow a different line, and it will happen like this as well. And if you start increasing again, it will follow not the same line as before, etc. Now, we modeled this in the 1970s using computers which were really slow, etc. And we were able to demonstrate with Hugh Williams in that paper I mentioned that the size of the error when you predict, assuming that habit is present and not, it can be very large. I mean, this was really a very disruptive thing if you didn't consider. So among the things that we look at in that paper of the behavioral theory of dispersion and the misspecification, well, habit was one of the most, as I said, insidious one, okay? Now, what happens is that formally, the state of the system, P, may be expressed as a path integral in the space of the utility components V. And the value is going to be path independent when habit is absent, but path dependent when it is present. You can see the discussion that we made in this paper. These ideas were taken later on, and that's what I say I've been consistent in my life, into an operational model by Cantillo, Heidecker, and myself in 2007. And this paper itself was a precursor of a habit shock panel data model we proposed with Francisca Yáñez and Elisabetta Kierke in 2009 as part of the PhD thesis of Francisca Yáñez. For that particular work, we used the Santiago panel. In 2007, there was a big change in the public transport system of Santiago. We introduced a new system called Trans-Santiago, which unfortunately was a mess at the beginning. It created a real chaos in the system. That was a real shock to the system. And I was lucky to have the vision of measuring, taking a sample of people choosing modes in Santiago before Trans-Santiago was implemented, a month after it was implemented when it was a mess, 6 months, a year, and 2 years afterwards when it has become much better. And we modeled this with Francisca in her PhD as a system which had 3 forces affecting the choice process. First, the relative values of the modal attributes of the competing modes as usual. Second, the habit or inertia effect. And finally, this new thing, the shock resulting from this abrupt policy intervention. And we assume, for example, that the utility of a certain alternative J for individual Q on wave W would be the typical utility component from the attributes minus this inertia effect that depended on R, the alternative that was chosen in a previous wave W, plus this shock that was a consequence of the policy intervention in the current wave. And we, in that particular paper, propose the following expressions for inertia and shock. Inertia, as you can see there, would be a function of the difference between the utility of the chosen alternative in the previous period, R, and the alternative that we are considering now. And of course, the amount of habit or inertia would depend on how big this difference was. And on the other hand, the shock was proportional to the difference between the utility of the alternative now, after the shock, and the utility before. And in this particular expression, the theta are population means and the sigma standard deviations of the inertia and shock parameters respectively for alternative J on wave W. SE represents socioeconomic variables that allow to incorporate in the model systematic variations on I and S, and the parameter delta allow to introduce panel correlation. Because we are using a panel, we don't assume that every wave is independent from the other, and therefore we have some panel correlation. Note that in this expression, if the inertia is greater than 0, it exists, there is habit, but it can be negative. And in this case, we have an individual who would have a high disposition to change. We will come back to this later on in the talk. Further, and as usual, the attributes and the socioeconomic characteristics have parameters that can be either fixed or random. So we are in the realm of mixed logic models. And finally, the random error term can be formulated as 2 components, an individual specific random effect and the typical random error which distributes extreme value type 1 Weibel or Gumbel, you know, to have a kind of a logit expression at the end. That model, so I don't know how to come back. That model was estimated, and we would need somebody like Chandra Bhatt, who is present here, I think, to help us in estimating it, because it's very, very complex. However, we were able to show that it was identifiable. We could identify all those things, except typically the scale factor of the logit model. So it was actually quite interesting, and we did a lot of little studies with that model and have some papers published on it. Anybody interested, I can give you some reference. Now, I want to move to this ended, if you want, that line of work on my part in 2012 with this kind of papers on panel data. But panels are hard to come by and hard to get and expensive, and therefore I abandoned that line after some 5 waves of the Santiago panel. And then I started looking at habit from a different perspective, with the help from psychology. And I want to show you here in what I have left 2 examples of using this way of looking at habit. The first, in the case of bicycle choice. If you look at bicycle choice, you will be aware that subjective variables, such as attitudes and perceptions, come up very strongly in explaining choice. And there is a very nice paper by Monde Birke and 2 Germans and myself on this issue. So, for example, people who have a pro-environmental attitude would typically find cycling more attractive. However, people that have a higher perception of risk will probably consider a barrier, this risk-prone attitude, to choosing a bike. On the other hand, lots of studies have shown that trip distance, availability of facilities like cycle lanes and safe parking for the bikes, and even showers and lockers at destination are important variables, which are of a different nature. This is very interesting, the showers and lockers, because it depends a lot on the climate of the place that you are considering. Studies in psychology and human behavior highlight that neither soft or hard measures to encourage changes are really effective if they are not accompanied, as I say here, by triggers that encourage change in habit. And I have a great admiration for psychologists. They have developed studies on how to measure the strengths of habit. And there is in particular something called the Self-Report Habit Index, SRHI, which was developed originally, I believe, by Fair, Planken, and Orwell in 2003. And this had about 12 indicators that people have to answer in a Likert 5-point scale, from, say, I'm totally in agreement to I'm totally in disagreement, 5 points. And we, well, if you look at those 12 indicators, to me, I am a brutal engineer, they looked very much like the same thing. I mean, how are we going to ask exactly the same thing, 12 and the 12 different guises, but they are basically the same thing. So we adapted a subscale for parsimony, and we realized later that some people have done this also before, so probably not all of them psychologists. And I will show you here an example of this, and I will show you my amazement at the fact that the thing actually worked much better than I thought. Well, in this particular study, we use 2 latent variables apart from habit. One was cycle facilities, which was based on the answer in this Likert scale 1 to 5. What would encourage you to make this trip by bike? Protected bicycle lanes, bicycle parking areas, guarded or enclosed bicycle parking areas, and also availability of showers, lockers at my place of work study. And it came out great with a factor Cronbach of 0.78. The second one was a variable related to risk, and we have this, I am concerned about the possibility of having an accident or being robbed, being mugged, but also I am concerned about having a mechanical problem and not knowing what to do. In our sample, in people from Chile, basically, women were really concerned about this issue in terms of using a bike. They are apparently, Chilean girls are not so good at mechanical solving like men are. That was one thing that came in our study. And finally, which is the one I wanted to show here, there was this habit questions. Using my current transport mode for my daily trip to work or study is something that I do automatically, I do without thinking, I start doing before I realize I'm doing it, I do without having to consciously remember. I don't know how many of you here are brute engineers like myself, and to whom these four things probably look very much the same. Interestingly, if you look at the answers from the population, sorry, from our sample to these questions, the response to them was actually quite different. So credit to psychologists once again. Sorry. Correct. Oh, what happens here? Oh, I'm sorry. I cannot move now. There, great. So look at this. This is a summary of the responses to our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not in agreement to completely in agreement. And as you can see, each of these had quite different responses from the people. So again, I think that this proves the point that these things were considered different by the people, and therefore it's worthwhile measuring them. And perhaps we should really consider eventually going for the 12. Anyway, that was one study. I have some results, but I don't have the time to comment them. So I will go very quickly to the next one, which is the case of motorcycle use. As you know, in Asia, there are countries where they have more motorcycles registered than cars because they are very low cost and they operate also with low cost, but they are very dangerous because people use them to drive, skipping traffic in rush hours. But they have become an interesting alternative mode in cities in Africa and Latin America too. Few efforts have been made to explore the underlying motivations for owning and using a motorbike. We have some feelings about which could be those things, but we don't know them for sure. And therefore, it's hard to define public policies for controlling or managing the growth of bike, given its high environmental and safety impacts. And also, experts debate whether the increase in use of motorcycle is connected with a decrease in public transport patronage. And this would be another reason to consider that this mode is actually a setback in terms of sustainable urban planning. Now, I will refer here very, very quickly to a study that we just completed in Bogota. It hasn't been published yet. And here we were looking at the preference for using motorcycle, and we defined 3 possibilities. Low, if the motorcycle is not used in all commuting trips. Medium, if it's used for all commuting trips. And high, if it's used also for other type of trips. And in parentheses are the percentages of people in our sample that were in the 3 categories. Again, here we use 2 latent variables, public transport perception and pro-motorcycle personality. I will stop here for a minute because I thought it was quite nice. Having a motorcycle matches my lifestyle. I like using a motorcycle. Buying a motorcycle was important for me. Traveling on the motorcycle makes me feel free and makes me feel pleasure. And those came as interesting. The first one against the use of motorbike, the second one in favor. And finally, we have habit. In this particular case, we used only 2 of these things. For my main trip, I use a motorcycle without a doubt. Again, answering a Likert scale. Not using the motorcycle for my main trip is difficult. And in this particular case, and to end the lecture, I show you very briefly the results of this experiment. I use the low preference as the base, so I have measured the utilities for medium and high in relation to that one. So we have an alternative specific constant that is positive and negative respectively. Habit comes only important and significant in the case of high preference. The promoter bicycle personality and public transport perception come with a correct sign in both. Having a pre-accident is very important in the case of the high preference, and so on and so forth. And here, there are 2 other ones that I might refer to them later on, which are that in the case of people living in areas which have a high population intensity, 500 meters around the house, or that people that live in the periphery, they are quite significant for the case of medium preference. Okay, so I think I ran of my time allotted, Jinsua. So I will finish here, and I will just show to you the reference I quoted. So if anybody would like to have a copy of this papers. I gave the presentation to Professor Sua, so you can have it. Okay, that's it for me.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Ortuzar. Also presented succinctly on time. So I will start with some question, but also would like to invite audience to put your question and comments into the chat, right? Also, Professor Ortuzar, you named Professor Chandra Bart, John Niles. If you want to jump in, add some comments, please let me know, and then let's have a conversation together, right? So I'll start from a few questions. The first part will start from more of the kind of data collection part, right? You mentioned that the psychologists developed this whole like a psychometric measurement scales, right? They apply it in all sorts of contexts, in habit, environmental consciousness, education, etc. Well, when we adopt them into transportation, I find that we often adopt them in an ad hoc way, right? You'll find if you were to compare two different transportation researchers, one from Europe, one from Latin America, one from America, they may think about the same latent concept, but use very different scales of actual measurement. So that makes the comparability really difficult, right? So you've been expert on this data collection, survey design. What's the effort so that the industry share a coherent design and implementation of those like a latent variable measurement? Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, I'm not certain if I understood totally correctly your question, but I would tell you that in my opinion, it is very hard to actually have a totally common way of measuring in different cultures and in different countries with different socioeconomic characteristics and, for example, risk averse, etc., preference, blah, blah, blah. So what I would recommend in general would be always to start with your literary review, where you will find which are the most important potential variables, etc., that you can have a look at, but then always use focus groups and things like that to check that you are the proposals that you are doing are actually consistent with what is happening in your own reality. I would never dream of using one thing from another place directly because it won't work probably. And we have done several studies where we compare the results of things that we have done in Chile with meta models that have been estimated from models taken in several parts, and we found huge difference when we consider our own case. I don't know whether that answers your question.
It does, yeah. So it seems there's a conflict of two principles here. One is the respect of a local culture, customize the design of these questions, versus another desire of standardization, so there is a comparable, right? So there's always such a tension between the two different goals here.
Yeah. Well, yes, that index, for example, the HRI index, it has been proven and validated by the psychologists in several instances. And we use it, but we had to adapt some of the ways of the questions were presented, having kind of, if you want, the same idea behind, but not necessarily in the same words, because the wording can be extremely important when you are asking questions to people in a survey.
I see. Yeah. The second question is related to the panel data structure, right? You mentioned that you have pursued both pathways. One is the panel data structure and using a particular intervention or this opportunity of a metro being open, versus later you use the latent variable approach, right? For now, you've done both. What's your assessment of both approach? What do you see into the future? How will they evolve and potentially connect to each other? What's your thought on both?
Right, that's a very good question. I personally love panel data models. And I think that actually if you really want to do work in this area and tackle the consequences of predicting in the future with these kind of issues in front of you, I think that the panel data approach is probably going to be preferable. Oh, good, I recovered that. However, it is very expensive, and therefore it requires a lot more resources. Typically, if a government or a firm would like you to do something about that, they will ask you to do it in a very ridiculous short time span. and therefore you are not going to be able to work on it properly as you would require. And in that case, then the habit approach with the psychological measure, etc., is a very good, in my opinion, second best. That would be my answer.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so both approach are still within this utility maximization framework, the general framework, right? So here, I mean, if the view that habits can lead to behavior without goal seeking, right? So the model, the utility maximization framework itself, presume there's a process there, presume that people pursuing a goal. But if much of the habit is saying that I'm doing that without thinking about utility, without thinking about exponent, so is there an entire different framework of thinking about this that being pursued, or what do you see the prospect on that?
Yeah, well, that again, lovely questions. Thank you very much. I will tell you what. I mean, I think that the habit thing, when you are in a system that doesn't change at all, is actually quite true, that you do it automatically and without thinking and all those things that we ask if you want. However, there is never such a thing that never changes at all. And if there is a shock, then most definitely it won't. I mean, the shock will break the habit, and therefore will allow you to reprocess, and there will be another kind of optimization, if you want, again. However, and this is very nice because it ties with another mania of myself, which comes from the 1970s, which is not only habit, but it's the idea that people, not all people choose in the same way. I mean, there are people that choose using the random utility model, if you want, but there are people that choose using elimination by aspects or by using the satisficing, or, I mean, people vary, and maybe it varies with, it varies with the complexity of the situation that you are analyzing. So in very complex situations, maybe you resort to much simpler ways of doing it, and therefore maybe habit becomes even more important. And in very simple ones, maybe you are allowed to think it a little more. So it is really a very intricate field of study, and I'm really still very, very kind of interested in doing things in this area.
I see. Yeah, and that's why I like for you to share with us your experience of working with psychologists, right? So the two disciplines, we know that we should learn from each other. There are a lot of different, like a tradition, different way of emphasis. How successful? I mean, are transplant engineers really working with psychologists closely, or we just read some literature, borrow some idea without really a deeper engagement with each other?
Yeah, well, I have been in the second type. I have been reading a little bit and using a little bit of what they do, because actually, I will tell you something. I have a fantastic, it's nothing to do with this talk, but when about 20 or 30 years ago, at the School of Engineering, they decided that professors needed to be better in terms of handling students and their emotions and so on. So they brought a set of psychologists to our school, and they taught us how we should behave. For example, I was a typical guy that was in my room working my computer. A student would knock the door, and I would say, "Come in," without looking at the guy. And the guy would be standing there, and I would say, "Stop, just a minute, I have to finish this," you know? And then I would look at him and perhaps answer the questions that he had. And the psychologist said, no, that is not, you shouldn't do that. You should stop doing your work, open the door, bring the guy, sit him down, and then every time that the guy says something, you should say a phrase reinforcing what the guy is saying. For example, "Professor, I have a query. Oh, I note that you are concerned." "Yes, I am very concerned." You know, and it was like magic. It was ridiculous because there were sets of phrases that, to me, the brute engineer, seemed to be really ridiculous. I mean, but the students or the person in front of me would take them as cues and would come and open up much better than anyone. So I admire psychologists from 30 years ago from those lectures. Now, if you want to answer your question more properly, you should go to Thomas Hancock and Stefan Hess, which have really tried to incorporate the work of psychologists into their into choice models, but it's very complicated. I mean, because psychologists don't want to actually predict. They are not pragmatists like we are. They want to understand. And actually, we also want to understand, but we want to understand because we want to predict. And therefore, our models are much simpler in a sense, although they may give results which are very useful.
Thank you. Thank you for the episode there. That's really interesting. So
Okay.
From understanding then to prediction, but then fundamentally we want to make change, right? As you mentioned that there are a lot of bad habits in the transportation, both individually, but also collectively, right? That is at odds with our climate change goal or public health goal. So based on your research, not only we need to model and understand habit, so what are the approach to really change and tackle and trigger the different formation of habit? So my question is, from what we learned of modeling.
Yes, I will tell you something. Yes, I have a little problem now. Apparently my connection is getting not so good. Hello, are you there? Right? Yeah.
Yes,
so I will close my video a little bit because I think it may help me to have a better signal, because I am in this remote place of the country I told you, and my Wi-Fi is not so good. Huh? Okay, because I lost some of your words. That was the problem. I couldn't understand the question.
Based on the learning through the models that you get about how do you understand and predict using habit, what can we do to actually change habit so that we can really go towards more sustainable mobility?
Yeah. Okay. Well, to be honest with you, I don't know. I think that the only answers I have found so far are that
Juan de Dios, we cannot hear you now. Yeah, let's give Professor Ortuzar a moment. I know, Chandrabart, do you want to add some thoughts? Professor Ortuzar mentioned you're contributing a lot to this work as well. Please.
Jinhua, I think all of these are very open questions. We are certainly in an exciting moment, I think. My own sense is that perhaps a little bit different from Juan de Dios, we are able to incorporate a lot of these psychometric, psychological-based measures into our modeling mechanisms. I think way better than what we have been able to. But to go back to your question, and I think Ryan and I were having this conversation, influence, how do we influence so that we move people toward a certain desirable habit? And what a desirable habit can be debated by itself. But for example, in some of the work that we have done, how do you move people toward transit use and bicycling? The best time to do that is when they are young. And when they are young, they are a little bit more malleable. And, some of those, as they get older, start sticking as habits because people tend to be less prone to change as they age. So when is the best time to, encourage bicycling and walking? It's not when we are in 30s and 40s, but start from the young age. And we actually had a panel where we looked at how behavior when they were young impacted their behavior as they came into adulthood. And, it was very interesting. Yes, if they had experienced walking transit use when they were young, it did transfer to adulthood. Similarly, physical activity also. So this malleability when we are young, I think can be made better use of. And this is something interesting we found in the context of physical activity in particular, including walking and bicycling, pinging parents. Can we ping parents so that, they are able to bring about some changes in their child's habit? So if you want to improve physical activity in adulthood, it seems like the best way is to ping the mom. And I don't know why that is so, not the dad. How much the dad does physical activity doesn't seem to impact the kids' activities and into adulthood. But the mom's physical activity seems to impact how much kids pick up, and that also transfers into adulthood. Anyway, Professor Ortuzar is back, so I'm going to keep quiet.
Sure. Thank you, Chandra. Yeah. So we lost you for a minute or two.
Yes, I changed to my cell phone now. Hope it will be better.
Yeah, it's very good. Now we can hear and see you very well.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe I'll end with my last question and then give it to John for the audience question as well. And also again, Professor Luis Williamson, if you like, please add any remarks. John Niles, etc. I see several interesting comments in the chat as well. So the last question is, how do we bring the academic research as a modelers to the transportation planning practice here, right? We know many of the cities, they have models, right? We model our travel. How much the habit as an important construct has been incorporated into those practiced transportation models in various cities that Professor Ortuzar, you've been practicing and consulting with many cities. What do you see as the best practice of certain cities actually incorporate this idea into their own model?
Yeah, look, I'm not a consultant as you think. I have done not very many practical studies really, but in here, for example, in my own country, we have done not very much. I mean, we were very lucky, for example, that the government, because we had a person that had studied in our university at the time as a member of the ministry, was interested in the Santiago panel. So we were able to finance a couple of more waves, and they used that apparently, but that was then, there was a change of government, that person left, and that was it. And I don't think I have seen any real incorporation of something like habit in practical models for urban planning so far.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so now I'll give it to John for the audience question here. Let me add John to this.
Thank you so much, Juan de Dios. We had a lot of activity in the chat. So I'm gonna start out with a question from John Niles, which is, some transportation sustainability advocates like to cause officially authorized car-free days in cities, either once in a while or periodically for certain major streets. In your opinion, does research inform whether this periodic forced mode change is enough of a shock to influence long-run mode choice habits? What do you think about that? What do you think about these car-free days? Do they seem to work?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a wonderful question. We don't have car-free days in Chile, but there have been car-free days in places like Bogota. And as far as I know, they do work. I mean, not perhaps as much as we would like, but people that do not use the car at all realize that it's not impossible, and that sometimes it can be very pleasant. And people, for example, that start using the bike become really fans of the bike, and they change. So I believe that the answer to that question is a partial success. And I think that they should be done more, because I think they are a good way of making this to happen.
Excellent. A sort of strategic nudge or a minor shock, if you will, yes, to the system. We have another great question from Nideva O'Connell, which is, are consistent habits simply second nature, or are people conscious of their attachments to their habits? With significant interruption where the status quo is impossible to maintain, such as the pandemic, of course, but also transit system closures, such as the Orange Line closure in Boston this past summer, how quickly do we see new habits form en masse? And is it possible to measure reticence to forced change of habit? There's a lot to unpack in that question.
I mean, these questions are wonderful. Thank you very much for the people that are putting them. In this particular one, unfortunately, I don't have any answer that I'm kind of satisfied with my answer. I just have thinking about it, and I I am not a psychologist, as I said, as I'm a brute engineer. I have the feeling that habits are long range depending on certain characteristics of for example, the alternative that you are in. For example, the people that are car users, they do have a strong habit because they perceive the car as something that makes them look better. For example, if I have a car which is very, very nice, and I find a schoolmate that is using a car which is not so good, I feel kind of better than him. Huh? And that guy perhaps was better than me at school, but now I have a better car. And that kind of ridiculous stuff, it's actually on play here. In my country, we have a wonderful story. The best actor in the country participated in a little propaganda exercise for the motor cars companies, and where he was riding a bike, and very funny guy, and somebody would come in a car and shout to him, "Change to a car, Perico," right? And the guy put a very funny face, and that worked wonders for not helping the bike. And now, instead, if you look at what is happening, young people consider that car users are old, fat, lazy guys, and that driving a bike is young, is against the obesity pandemic, is pro-environment, and therefore there are ways of kind of helping this new trend. And obviously, the pandemic helped in that sense, in a sense, because people were not very happy to go, for example, in public transport, because they were very scared of getting the COVID, but in a bike, they were free, they were in the open air. So yeah, I don't know much about this, but I have the feeling that some habits are more strong than others, but they all can be kind of turned, at least to a certain extent.
Let's just build on that a little bit, because there are a number of questions related to public transportation, and particularly a large number of questions related to cycling, the use of bikes. So maybe just to start with public transportation, you talked about the shock that happened in Santiago with the Trans-Santiago system. Could you maybe just elaborate on that story a little bit? So what is it that happened? And when you reflect on it, what were some lessons perhaps that could potentially be shared with today's public transportation operators, which in many ways are struggling, with the post-pandemic shock to the system? Here in the United States, many prominent public transportation organizations are facing a bit of a crisis. They call it the fiscal cliff. They're trying to get ridership back. What suggestions or reflections, if any, would you have for today's public transportation systems when they think about, this concept of habit and choice?
Yeah. Well, the story of Trans-Santiago is a story that has now over 15 years. I think that we wrote a paper with Juan Carlos Muñoz, who is now the Minister of Transport in Chile, where we call it something like the rise and fall, the fall and rise of a public transport system, because the system was invented and was in principle was going to be much better than what we had. We had a system of total free competition where there were a lot of accidents. There were a lot of bad things about the public transport, although it was really very massive and very present everywhere. But you have to pay twice if you want to change a bus, and the bus drivers were not really employees in the sense that you consider it in America. So it was really messy. And Trans-Santiago incorporated a coordination between the underground and the buses, and you have only one fare for how long is your trip. It doesn't matter whether you change or not. The bus drivers and the other people are treated as proper employees, so they have a time to relax and etc. They have proper salaries, and there is a lot of things. However, it's more expensive, and it was defined in a way which required a lot of transfers. Yeah? So before, you could go from one place to the city to another in one bus, and it would take you a very long time, but it was only one bus. Now, by definition, you would have to change because the buses would go to the center and then you would have to change to another one. There would be much shorter services. That was very efficient in principle, but you need to change. And unfortunately, when we designed this, I wasn't involved, but when we, the Chileans, designed it, we were not aware that that transfers are not just a waste of time and a waste of, and possibly a waste of money if you have to pay again, but a waste of time, but they are also something psychologically alien, which is change. And we had a weight for the extra time incorporated in the modeling, but we didn't have any weight for the change itself. And after that, I did a study with a girl that doing a Master of Science, where we found that the weight of just changing was even higher than the weight of the extra time. So for maybe we could have designed the thing much better. However, in time, and when it was implemented, it was very badly implemented because nobody knew where the new buses would come and go. Nobody knew how to change. It was a real mess. And it took about a year to become a little bit better. But by that time, the government had made a mistake, huge mistake, by saying that until the system is not working properly, you don't need to pay. And therefore, we inherited a huge evasion from the beginning, if you want, because people still are saying the system is not so good, so I'm not paying. And we have sometimes a 30% evasion, and that is a mess, and we are trying to solve that one. Well, this will depend on the Chilean that you ask, will give you a different story. I am of a part of the people that think that now Transantiago is probably by far the best system in Latin America. As a combination of buses and underground. But some people still believe that this has been the worst public policy ever in the history of the country.
Yeah, a terrible habit to form, I guess, by offering it, for free in the beginning. Yeah. Let me turn over to bicycles. So yeah, again, lots of conversation about the modality of bicycles, and I think a lot of interest in the slide that you presented that looked at that mode. So there's a question from Luke Knappen that basically says, look, I still don't understand why people in the Netherlands heavily use the bike much more than people in parts of Belgium that have nearly the same environmental infrastructure. This is a comment, but as you put it into the context, I mean, do you have thoughts on that, on sort of the, bike culture, what sorts of what policies, if anything, could be implemented to sort of nudge people into that habit of bicycle usership?
I should. I should, if I had done my homework properly for today. I know that the Dutch are, I mean, I have a colleague of myself, Lex Sagaris, who is the champion of bicycles in my country. She's a Canadian that lives in Chile. And she admires the Dutch no end because they have been for over 30 years, I think, really messing around with the bikes and doing things and change. And the Belgians probably have not. And that's the only explanation. I mean, they haven't done the same things as the Dutch, because if they had, they would have probably the same results. But the good thing is that now I think that everywhere, I mean, for example, Santiago is a city that has about 7 million people, and that is about 900 kilometers, square kilometers in size. So it's a huge city. However, if you look at the average distance traveled in Santiago, is less than 7 kilometers. And Santiago is very flat. And Santiago has a wonderful weather. So it would be really, for a large number of trips, be possible to be made by bike. My wife is 72, and she goes by bike to her work and to everywhere else in Santiago, traveling sometimes 20 kilometers in the day. And she's really happy about it. And she's not a young girl anymore at all. And we don't have very good bicycle lanes and etc. But people are starting to respect the bikes more because there are more bikes now than before. So they have to respect them more. And more young people are using bikes. And this thing kind of reinforces itself. And you see it in the news and every day, and there are more bicycle lanes and so on. And I hope that in perhaps 5 or 10 years more, we will have a share of about 10% of use of bike.
Yeah, it's interesting. Andrew McFadden had a comment about the seasonality, different weather patterns. How does that break the good habits of bicycle ridership, and what complementary modes during the winter, other factors affect ridership patterns after the winter? It builds a little bit on what you were just saying. When you think of Santiago, what do you see significant shifts?
No, because Santiago doesn't have a weather problem. Santiago it goes from 10 degrees to 18 degrees during the year, more or less. I mean, the worst you can have in your life is 30 degrees, but it's dry. And the worst you can have in your life is 0, but it only happens once in the winter or something. No, so Santiago is not example in that sense. I mean, if you go, for example, to the Caribbean, then you cannot ride the bike because this is horrendously hot. And you really would die riding your bike. Or maybe in Boston in the winter, it's impossible because it's too cold. I don't know. So we don't have that experience, but I'm sure, I mean, it has been found in many studies that the weather is obviously a big predictor of bicycle use.
You're encouraging all of us to come and plan a visit to Santiago.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Ortuzar, both for the presentation, but also the several personal stories that you share with us. This is really brilliant. Everybody, please join me. Thank Professor Ortuzar for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.